When you're new to rigging and you try and wrap your head around everything at once, it can be quite daunting. So let me try and break it down into smaller chunks for you. Now, each of the big concepts that I'm going to mention here is going to get its own dedicated lesson in a later chapter. However, in this lesson, I'd just like to talk about the main concepts of rigging and some of the terminology that you'll need to know. Now, first off, you might look at a rig that has lots of bones and be really confused. But really, in all of these bones, and in any rig in fact, there are only three main functions that any bone will have. There will be deformation bones, control bones, and mechanism bones. So the deformation bones are the ones that actually deform the mesh. They do all the bending and the twisting. Then you have the control bones. This should be obvious. These are the ones that the animator uses to control the rig. And the mechanism bones, now these are the helper bones that are needed to make the rig do what you want through drivers and constraints. Now, if you think about these bones as only having these functions, hopefully it will become less daunting. Deformation, control, and mechanism. So how do you build a rig and connect everything so it does what you want it to do? Well, there's also only three main things. There's parenting, there's constraints, and there's drivers and custom properties. And they kind of work in tandem with each other. So parenting, this should make sense to you already. All objects and or bones can have a parent. So when the parent moves, the child can follow along, but it can also move freely. Then we have constraints. Here's just a little example. We're going to copy the location from this bone to the other bone. And now it will always follow along, even though it's not parented. Now, some constraints will not allow you to move or rotate the bone when it is constrained. So that's where our parenting comes in. So if this is a control bone that you needed to animate, you would give it a parent, so it would follow along, and then add the constraint to the parent and not the control. And now it follows along, and you can move the control freely when needed. Now, this parenting concept with constraints is used quite a lot, which is why I've mentioned it here. I want to plant that seed early. And then we have drivers and custom properties. Now, I've mentioned these two together because they kind of work together as buddies. Now, drivers can be used for some complicated things. However, the most common use in rigging by far is to use a driver as a switch to turn on or off a constraint. Now, it's common to create a custom property and then connect it to this constraint and drive it as this switch. That's why they kind of work together. Now, as I said, you can do some really complicated things with drivers, but this switch concept is as far as we're going to be taking it in this course. Now for some other important concepts. You will need to understand space. Now, I'm not talking about the galaxy, I'm talking about world space, local space, pose space, and transform space. It sounds really confusing, but these are all just coordinate systems that have different reference points. You also may have learnt a little bit about different spaces before in some of the other courses, but armatures have extra spaces. But don't worry, as I said, this sounds more complicated than it is, and there'll be more on this later. Now, one big concept is weight painting. Now, this can also be called weighting, skinning, or binding. There's many different names, but basically this is how the geometry is moved by the rig. You assign weights to the vertices, and then those will follow along with the bones. Now, weight painting is a little bit of an art in itself. We'll be going over this in its dedicated lesson later on. Now, there's a few more seeds that I want to plant early. And that is that the order of the constraint stack and the modifier stack matters. It is calculated from the top to the bottom. So the order that you put your constraints or the order that you put your modifiers makes a difference. All right, is that seed being planted? Excellent. That's going to help you do some problem solving if you ever run into issues. Now, finally, this is probably the most important concept to understand. You are building a rig to be animated by an animator. Now, that might be you or it might be someone else. Either way, the rig should be as simple as needed and no simpler. Now, this doesn't mean it can't be super technical and complicated under the hood, and sometimes it has to be to get the desired result. But the aim is to at least make it really simple to control. And to me, simple means logical and neat. So it's good practice to organize your controls into layers so you can easily display the controls that you want and hide the ones that you don't, and give your controls custom shapes to make it easier to use, especially if you need to select a control that is obscured by the mesh. All right, so that is the rigging concepts in a nutshell. On with the learning. I'll see you in the next lesson.